Okay, let's get started. So my name is Megan Reuther, and I'm an attorney in Tonkin's Labor and Employment Group. I'm sure you've heard this statement before, but marketing's asked us to read a little introduction before we get started. So just bear with me for a second. Today I'm going to be talking about tips on dealing with a COVID-19 diagnosis in the workplace. My hope is to provide you with some practical advice for your business to thrive during this pandemic. If you have questions unique to your business, I invite you to reach out to me or the Tonkin Torp lawyer that you generally work with. Now I want to make a little quick note about the format. First, just so you know, we are actively recording this webinar. You do not need to sign any disclosure, and no private information about yours is going to be shared. That being said, if you choose to participate in our Q&A session, your question is going to be recorded in association with your name. To that end, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom app. I'll do my best to answer some of the questions as they come up, but I want to make sure I have enough time for the presentation, so I might wait till the end to answer your question. Because the situation is so rapidly changing, there might not be an answer to your question, or it might be too nuanced for me to address in this webinar format. If that's the case, I welcome you to reach out to me or to the Tonkin Torp attorney that you generally work with. I welcome any feedback that you might provide for this webinar. If there are any topics that you want to hear more about, please tell us. We're actively thinking about other topics that we could provide or information that would be helpful for you. Tonkin Torp hopes to be a source of information for the business community throughout this challenging time and may hold additional webinars going forward. Finally, the information presented here is current as of July 30th, 2020, and is not intended to be legal advice. Okay, let's get started. We've all seen the numbers. This shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but cases in Oregon have been rising and steadily increasing. I think the average every week seems to be between 200 to 300 and even higher. And we're not alone. Our neighboring states, California and Oregon, are also dealing with similar circumstances with their cases rising. It's true across the United States. So as the COVID-19 outbreak continues, we're going to continue to have interruptions in our operations and our normal workplace. And more employers are going to face the reality of what to do if an employee tests positive in the workplace or shows presumptive positive symptoms as listed on by the CDC. That's particularly true for employers who have employees who can't telecommute and are going to be present in the workspace. Now, this could come up in a variety of ways, and the advice that I'm giving, or the suggestions and steps that I'm giving today are relevant for each of the different ways it could come up. You could have an employee who reports to you that they actually tested positive. They took a COVID test and it was positive. More likely, because of the delays in testing and the concern about going to see healthcare providers right now, unless you absolutely need to, you're going to have employees that report to you that they're experiencing COVID-like symptoms in the workplace. You also could have an employee who actually comes to work and you or a supervisor actually see that they're displaying COVID-like symptoms or show them for the first time while at work. Regardless of how it arises, the goal today is to provide just some tips and some steps that you can take to mitigate the risk and to handle positive and presumptive positive cases in the workplace. Just as a little aside, I personally am very tired of looking at the COVID molecule virus. I'm not really sure what it's called. I'm, not a scientist, but I've included it here in the introduction so that you can all agree with me that you're tired of looking at it. So as an alternative and as an entertainment value, I desperately am in need for a different quarantine hobby. I want to give a special thanks to my dog Atticus and his friend Frankie, who contributed to this webinar, as you will see. They were mostly willing participants. I can't hear you all say "ah," but you obviously did. So let's get started. So the first step is to be prepared for this to happen. We can all hope that it doesn't happen, but we should be ready and have a plan in place. And that plan is going to consist of having some written procedures, training, and communicating to your workforce. If you've been listening to these webinars, we've discussed developing a procedure or plan to address various aspects of the COVID pandemic. This isn't any different. Having a plan in place will allow you to respond quickly. And if you have a positive case in the workplace, time is of the essence. We want to move as fast as we possibly can to mitigate any risk and to protect their workforce and your operations. So we're going to spend the majority of this webinar talking about different plans and different steps you can take. Each of these can be created before there's a case and should be created before there is a case. This could include separating the impacted employee, asking employees who had close contact to also stay home, making sure you're ready with appropriate cleaning procedures and you know how you're going to handle that and who's going to handle that, having in place a contract tracing methodology, know what questions you're going to ask and what steps you're going to take in that investigation, making sure you're protecting confidentiality. Even though, this pandemic seems to have ended almost everything, confidentiality requirements are still, required. I've mentioned, to back up just for a second, I got a little bit ahead of myself there. You're having a plan now will allow you to designate who is going to be in charge of the different steps in your process. So who is actually going to be running the contract tracing? Who is going to be having those communications with the employees? Making sure people know what their roles are ahead of time will allow them to act quicker and to be more comfortable. Also, having a written policy in place will allow your workforce to feel more comfortable and potentially a little bit less anxious, knowing that you're ready to address these issues if they arise. Your policy should also lay out clearly what the consequences of noncompliance would be. So if an employee refuses to provide information for contract tracing or doesn't timely report a diagnosis, all that information should be laid out in your policies. It should also identify the person that the employee is going to want to talk with, who their contact person will be for both the contract tracing, but also to report their illness and to report their recovery when they're ready to come back to work. Having that open line of communication where they feel confident that their confidentiality is going to be respected is important. Having these procedures in place before a diagnosis also allows for training. And the training should be particularly targeted at supervisors or HR personnel that are going to be handling putting in place the procedure. For example, an employee might tell their supervisor first about their diagnosis, or a supervisor might notice the COVID symptoms for the first time. So they need to know what to do with that information and how to handle it. They need to know to report it quickly to HR or to their supervisor, whoever is going to be putting in place the programs, and also to make sure that they're protecting confidentiality. That's also important. It's important that supervisors don't talk with their co-supervisors who don't have a need to know that information. Training might also include how they're going to be communicating to the employees, how to safely clean materials, especially if you're using more hazardous materials that you wouldn't normally use in a household, and what questions they can ask or can't ask symptomatic employees. Along these same lines, creating a plan ahead of time allows you to communicate that to your employees. Again, this will decrease some of the anxiety, but it will also tell employees what's expected of them. If employees are going to be required to participate in contract tracing, they should know that ahead of time. For example, an employee might have a better idea of where they've been in the workplace and who they've talked to if they know ahead of time that they're going to need to provide that information. So they might be keeping track of it if they know that's expected of them. Make sure that if you update your plans, and you should be updating your plans as the guidance from state and local and federal agencies are changing, those updates are also communicated to employees. The key here is we want everybody to know what the plan is going to be and what's going to be expected of them. Okay, so now we're going to go through some of the steps that you might take if somebody reports to you that they're positive or presumptively positive, or if you identify that in the workplace. These aren't going to be all inclusive. We just don't have enough time. And also, what's needed for your workplace is going to depend based on the realities of your workplace. So step one, an employee, you have an employee that calls and reports that they either tested positive or are experiencing COVID-like symptoms. And again, when I say COVID-like symptoms, I actually mean the symptoms that the CDC has recognized as COVID-related. And those recommendations are going to change. I think they're constantly adding to that list. I think there's a rash on there now. I'm not sure. But make sure you're staying up to date on what those symptoms are. So the first step, I think, should be rather obvious, and that's to tell that employee to stay home and to follow up with their healthcare provider as needed. When they're ready to return to work and they should be communicating with you, follow the CDC guidance for that, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But what about an employee who comes to work and either a supervisor or somebody notices that they are displaying COVID-like symptoms, or for the first time they start developing those symptoms at work? What do you do? Well, the first step would be to have a supervisor or HR manager pull them aside and talk to them in private. And this is where training is going to really play an important role. We want to maintain that privacy, but we also want to keep that individual as safe as possible. The training employees, supervisors, HR professionals on the proper PPE that might be required. So we're going to be wearing a mask, we're going to be washing our hands, we're going to maintain a safe distance when we have these conversations. If the employee describes, or if you routinely take temperatures in the workplace, whatever, however you get the information, if there are CDC recognized COVID symptoms, the first step would be to send that employee home and just encourage them again to follow up with their healthcare provider as needed. Under either scenario, whether the employee tests positive or is presumptive positive, whether you recognize in the workplace or they self-report, make sure you're following the CDC guidelines on self-isolation and when it's appropriate to discontinue that. These change based on the symptoms that are being displayed. And again, they're just constantly changing as the CDC and the world learns more about this virus. I expect that we're going to constantly see changes. I think the beginning of July, they recently changed the days that need to do a pass since symptoms manifested. When I pulled it up yesterday, and I have to read this because I want to make sure I get this right. Persons with COVID-19 who have symptoms and were directed to care for themselves at home may discontinue isolation under the following conditions, and there's 3. At least 10 days have passed since symptom onset. At least 24 hours have passed since the resolution of a fever without the use of fever-reducing medications, and other symptoms have improved. And again, there's an asterisk on the CDC page when they're talking about this because it really depends on the type of symptoms they're displaying and the severity of the illness. So again, you want to make sure that we're following this as closely as possible. You're also going to be working during this time period with the impacted or the ill employee to make sure you're doing the appropriate contact tracing and to make sure that they're following the CDC guidelines for when it's appropriate to return to work. So for that reason, it's really important, and we're going to talk about contact tracing in more detail in a second, but for that reason, it's really important to make sure that you maintain open channels of communication with that employee and that they know who they should be contacting and who they should be working with in the office. Ideally, this would be an HR professional or a trained supervisor because, again, confidentiality and making sure that they're addressing any benefits issue and any requests for accommodations that could come up. There's a lot of different laws that intersect here. We want to make sure that we're following the proper procedure. Along those same lines, you're going to need to determine benefit eligibility for this person. If that employee was sent home and is self-isolating, they might be eligible for paid leave or paid sick time under state, local, or federal guidelines. Remember that if you're a covered employer under the Family First Act, there might be additional sick time that you need to provide, and make sure you're maintaining appropriate documentation for this. We've talked about these leaves and links in other webinars, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it here, but again, I just want to emphasize this is a really complicated area, so make sure you're working with either somebody who's very knowledgeable in this, or feel free to reach out to me or another Tonkin attorney to help with this. I also just want to remind you that while you're deciding whether you need to send an employee home and what the next step's going to be, that you remember to enforce your policies equally. So the way that I could see this coming up is if you have a temperature threshold and you're sending somebody home at that temperature threshold and somebody's just over it and you decide not to send them home, but there's somebody else who has the same temperature that you do send home, that would be unequal treatment. It doesn't matter if your intentions are good and the person that you send home is a higher risk. Apply your policy equally. Anti-discrimination, anti-retaliation laws are not going away during this pandemic. In fact, we're probably going to see more issues arise from them. Along the same lines, if you're doing contract tracing, another way this could come up is if you have two employees who both had quote-unquote close contact, as the CDC defines it, and you send one person to self-isolate, maybe because they're higher risk but not the other. We can't do that. We got to enforce the policies equally. So next, I want to talk a little bit about contract tracing. And the key here, and I'm going to keep saying this, is just to move quickly. We know that this virus spreads rapidly and that it's hugely contagious. So making sure we're tracking down anybody who could be potentially exposed with close contact, again, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, is going to be really important. The CDC recommends that anybody who had this close contact self-isolates for a period of time. I believe right now it's 14 days since the potential exposure. This is going to require a bit of an investigation from you. So this is going to require working with that impacted employee as soon as possible. And we're going to talk about this. So typically, you're going to designate somebody to be performing or at least be in charge of the contract tracing, oversee that it's being done. Hopefully this is the same person that is also working with the employee and keeping those open lines of communication, again, to protect confidentiality and to keep the circle as small as possible. So your policies should already designate who's going to be performing this, and this is an area where I do highly recommend we provide training ahead of time for no other reason than confidentiality, but also just to move quickly. If they already know what they need to do, then they'll be able to move as soon as possible. But which contacts are we looking at? We're not looking at everybody that the person came into contact with. We're specifically looking at people who they had quote unquote close contact. And Atticus is modeling that here for you. The CDC defines that as two different things. One is close contact for within 6 feet for a prolonged period of time, or somebody who is directly exposed to infectious secretions. So generally that's coughing, it's not licking, as Atticus is modeling. If you have an employee that licks, please see me after class. The most important time to be looking at this close contact is 40 hours before or after they became symptomatic. So pay close attention to that. And that may be a question that you need to ask the employee. So you're going to want the infected employee, to provide a list of people that they had close contact with within the first 14 days, the last 14 days, excuse me. And then you're going to need to follow up with those individuals. You may also want to ask the employee where they spent significant amount of time in the last 14 days, because you're going to want to pay closer attention to those areas when you do the cleaning and disinfecting, which again, we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. And again, the infected employee probably already knows this is going to be required of them if you've communicated your policies to them, and so they should be ready to provide this information. This wouldn't be a surprise. And again, if they know this is coming, hopefully they're paying closer attention to what they're doing in the workplace and who they're coming into contact with. I want to make a note here about teleworking employees. We've had questions about whether a teleworking employee, you need to still perform the contract tracing, and that depends. You're still going to need to confirm with that employee that they haven't been in the workplace and they haven't had any contact with their coworkers or vendors, third-party contacts that are associated with your business. If they haven't, if they've been at home for at least the last 14 days, then your contract tracing is going to be very limited. They probably haven't impacted the workplace. We're also seeing employers access new and upcoming apps for contract tracing. So I guess just take a step back here. So you've talked with the employee, they've given you a list. You're going to want to consider what other areas you can access for information. And Maybe you have sign in and out sheets. I hope that you do in your workplace. You can know who's been in the office at the same time as this employee. Perhaps you have signed in and out sheets for conference rooms, and so you know if they've been in a particular room and you know how long they were there. Whatever it may be, you're going to want to look at that information and compare that to the list you were given to make sure that you are letting everybody know that needs to know. As I mentioned, some employers are also using applications, and I think these are particularly interesting. Basically, hundreds of apps have started to be developed for contract tracing, and some of them have been repurposed from other usages. I think there was one in North Dakota that was used for tracking bison that's now being used for contract tracing. I just think that's fascinating. And typically how it works is employees would download them to their phone, and then they would, the apps would keep track if somebody else also with the app comes within 6 feet. And again, I'm not particularly good with the technology. And I'm not recommending any particular app. What you need for your workplace is going to really depend on what the realities of your workplace. If you're a huge employer and the employee has lots of contacts throughout the day, maybe some additional assistance would be helpful. And I'm also not advising on the privacy concerns or anything like that. I just want to raise that there are a lot of avenues out there available for you to perform that contract tracing. So make sure you're doing your research and you're really thinking about the procedures that are going to best fit your business. After you finish the contract tracing, you have the list of people who had the close contact. Make sure you work with them. You may require them, depending on what you've learned, to self-isolate for 14 days and monitor for symptoms. Again, you're going to want to follow the CDC guidelines for when it's appropriate and safe for them to return to work, and that'll depend on the circumstances. CDC does recognize that some employees are essential, and if they're not exhibiting symptoms, it may be appropriate for them to stay in the workplace under certain conditions. I'm not going to list them all up here. It's really detailed, but just flag that for you, that I do recommend that you take a look at that. Also, if an employee that you've asked to self-isolate starts exhibiting symptoms, make sure that they know that they need to communicate that to you, because that's going to change when it's appropriate for them to return to work. It's also going to trigger for you another contract tracing investigation potentially, depending on how soon after they left the workplace that they began exhibiting those symptoms. So make sure that you're keeping track and you're in communication with those employees. And throughout, I just have to mention again, make sure you're maintaining the confidentiality. Again, this doesn't go away. I'm going to keep hammering on this during the webinar because it's so important, and it would be such an easy way to get yourself into some trouble and to overlook during this health crisis. COVID-19 diagnosis is still considered confidential medical information under the ADA, even when you're dealing with a positive diagnosis in the workplace and even when you're trying to figure out contract tracing. So make sure you don't reveal the identity of that employee. You can, however, let employees know when the individual is last in the office so that they can get an idea for how long they need to monitor their symptoms. So in addition, sorry, that picture kills me. So in addition to letting the close contact employees know about a potential risk, OSHA's general duties clause may require that you also let the rest of your workforce know, at least the workforce that works in the same area or the same location as the impacted employee. Again, notification should be done without revealing any confidential medical information. I highly recommend a form notice so you don't risk providing more information necessary or risk confidentiality. Also think about third parties, people that aren't part of your organization or your company that may have come in contact with this employee. You may need to also let them know to monitor for symptoms. Again, the key here is we're trying to avoid community spread. And if we can provide some of that information while maintaining confidentiality. So we've talked about separating an employee from the workplace. We've talked about contract tracing. We've talked about communications to other employees. What else do you need to do? Again, this is probably pretty obvious, but you need to clean and disinfect. The CDC has very particular guidelines for this. So again, make sure that you're looking you're looking at the CDC website, and again, they're updating it regularly. OSHA also has some helpful information on this. The first step the CDC recommends is working with that employee to figure out where they might have been. Now, for my business, I'm mostly in my office, so that'd be pretty easy. But if you're an employer who has shared workspace or requires moving around the office a lot, perhaps it's somebody in reception that's dropping off packages throughout the day, whatever it may be, this may be a little bit more difficult and require a more thorough investigation. The CDC recommends to first close off any affected areas. So if they have a private office, make sure you shut the office, flag that other employees aren't allowed to be entering this. Depending on the circumstance, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to shut down your entire operation or your entire location, especially if you can contain it to one area. If you can't, if that employee's been everywhere, safest course of action might be to close for deep cleaning for a period of time. Again, this is going to depend on the layout of your workplace and the findings of your investigation. After you've closed off that space, the CDC recommends opening windows and allowing some ventilation, clearing out that space as much as possible. Next, it recommends waiting at least 24 hours to begin the deep cleaning. If 24 hours isn't feasible or you can't do 24 hours, make sure you wait as long as possible, especially if you have ventilation open, just to make it safe as possible for whoever is doing the cleaning. Make sure you're paying special attention to high touch areas. That's going to be particularly important. So areas where the employees spend a lot of time, kitchens, bathrooms where the employee might have been, door handles, those should already be routinely cleaned, but make sure that you're also cleaning them during this deep clean period. Now, if you're using cleaners that are more hazardous than just household cleanings, make sure the employees that are using them are trained on how to use those safely. This may require following some OSHA guidance. So OSHA's hazardous communication standard. Make sure that they understand the proper way to use that, and they've been provided the PPE necessary to use those materials safely. Keep in mind that the CDC has said that if an employee hasn't been in the workplace for more than 7 days, you may not need to be doing the deep cleaning that I've just suggested. That being said, if an employee, there's not a reason to not provide extra cleaning. I know I just used a double negative, but the idea here is that it makes your employees feel safer. I recommend providing that extra cleaning. And this is something I didn't mention earlier, but when you're having that communication to your workforce following the OSHA guidance, make sure you're letting them know the remedial measures that you've taken. So, we did deep cleaning, the affected employees have been notified, they're monitoring for symptoms, we'll keep you up to date, whatever it may be. Again, we're protecting confidentiality, but we're also reassuring our workforce. There may be some record-keeping requirements that are relevant, and this, again, is going to depend on whether the COVID-19 diagnosis is a quote-unquote recordable illness. So OSHA has said COVID can be if it is work-related. So the obvious question is, how do we determine if it's work-related? Well, the first step is you're going to need to do, again, another investigation. To ensure compliance, you need to document your efforts, the steps you took to determine whether the diagnosis was work-related. In fact, the reasonableness, the thoroughness of your investigation is going to be one of the factors that OSHA considers when deciding whether you complied with the requirement. In most circumstances, and not all circumstances, but most, OSHA recommends asking the impacted employee at least these 3 questions. When they believe they contracted the illness, where they believe they contracted the illness, whether there was out-of-work activities that may have contributed, as well as to review their environment to see if you can trace the source of that illness. Again, these questions may not be necessary if the source is obvious. For example, if they work in a shared space with 3 other employees who all developed COVID, the source may be obvious or known at that point. OSHA's guidance highlights certain evidence that also would weigh in favor of finding that it's work-related, and that would be if there's several cases within a close group of employees. if they contracted COVID after lengthy exposure to somebody another employee who had COVID, or if their duties just generally require frequent contact with the communities at large, that may weigh in favor of determining that the illness is work-related. And this was not all-inclusive. There are more factors to consider. And OSHA recently released, I guess not that recently anymore, recently is relative these days, guidance for when you were determining it's work-related. So I encourage you to look at that guidance really closely. Now, if you make a reasonable and good faith inquiry and you determine that it's, you can't determine the source or that it's more likely than not that it's work-related, the agency says that you don't need to record the illness. But again, let's be really sure and make sure you've documented your efforts to thoroughly investigate. Okay, the last thing I want to touch upon is just some potential pitfalls that I see, and I've mentioned a couple of them, and that's the confidentiality issue, but also moving quickly. If you delay, if you aren't ready for this, and COVID's allowed to spread in the workforce farther because you didn't move rapidly enough, that would be a potential issue and an area of liability for you. Another area is not staying up to date on the guidance. So we've talked about this a couple times too. The CDC in particular is constantly updating their guidance. So it needs to be a regular habit of yours to be looking at the guidance and making sure that your policies are still in line with it. Another area, a potential pitfall that I see is making sure that you're enforcing your prevention policies and procedures. Now, I haven't talked much about that or at all about that today, but that's been the topic of other webinars. So that would be your social distancing policy, your routine cleaning policy, your mask wearing policy. You'll notice Frankie is not wearing his mask correctly, so HR should have talked to him and told him to put it up over his nose. So whatever it may be, make sure you're enforcing them regularly and that you're monitoring your workforce to make sure that you are you're following whatever your procedures are. And finally, make sure that you're documenting. You're documenting your efforts to comply, you're documenting your efforts to do contract tracing, whatever it may be. And I know you've probably heard this a million times from attorneys in every single webinar. But documentation is going to be the best evidence that you complied and that you did your best to make sure your workforce is safe. Now I'm going to see if there are any questions. One question here is, are we allowed to ask about symptoms before they come back to work? If you've had an employee who has indicated that they've had symptoms or a positive diagnosis, you should be in contact with them to make sure that you are following the CDC guidance. And one of that is going to be having assurances from them that they are not symptomatic, or their symptoms started at least 10 days ago, or that their fever has abated and their other symptoms have decreased. So some of that is going to require that communication. Another question here is about requiring a doctor's note. So you should note that the CDC, generally if somebody's out for a couple days, requiring a doctor's note is something that some employers do. However, keep in mind that the CDC has recommended here that employers don't require a doctor's note, just given the fluidity and the reality of the situation. And that's because employees having to go in to the doctor could put them at greater risk, and getting a positive or negative COVID test, number one, is sometimes hard to access, and there's extreme delays right now in getting the results of those tests. So it just might not be practical under the circumstances. I'm going to wait a second to see if there's any other questions that I can answer. Okay, not seeing any, I'm going to end the webinar, but I thank you all for attending and hope that you'll reach out if you have any additional questions. Thanks.